Good evening. Welcome to the Jamie Glazov Show. This evening, our focus, fired for Islamophobia, which arguably also might mean fired for telling the truth about the religion of peace. We are honored and graced by the presence this evening of two very distinguished guests. The first, Eric Allen Bell, a regular blogger for the Daily Kos, where he was recently banned for the crime of writing 3 articles that ran afoul of the mindset there. He specifically named loonwatch.com as, quote, a terrorist spin control network. He is currently producing a documentary entitled Not Welcome that is about the backlash against construction of a 53,000 square foot mega mosque in America's Bible Belt. And we also have with us Dr. Tim Furnish, an author and Muslim world analyst who holds a PhD in Islamic history from Ohio State and who learned Arabic in the U.S. Army. His areas of expertise are Islamic eschatology, Mahdism, sex, and transitional movements. Gentlemen, welcome to the Jamie Glazov Show.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie.
Now, we've all promised each other in written statements that we're going to be very nice to each other this hour, right?
Right.
But,
I lost that paper, Jamie, but I'll try.
Yeah, but I can't guarantee what the callers will be saying. Thank you very much, both of you, for calling in. Eric, I think it makes sense to begin with you. This is quite a story. You were a regular blogger for the Daily Kos. I think, I don't know if it would be fair to say that you were more or less, if we were to use a label, of the liberal mindset. And yet, unlike many liberals, you had the courage and, you kind of went in the direction of making some criticism about Islam that I think could arguably be said is kind of not allowed in that milieu, in that sphere of our political existence, and you got in trouble for it. Tell us a little bit about what happened.
Well, I've written a few pieces for Common Dreams. I've written 4 or 5 pieces for michaelmoore.com. I wrote about 108 pieces for Daily Kos. Most of what I'd written for Daily Kos had to do with Occupy Wall Street, and those articles were very well received. Mm-hmm. Recently, I wrote an article saying I thought that loonwatch.com was defending radical Islam, and I followed it up with a more aggressive piece trying to substantiate my case with more facts and details, and also really saying that I just thought Islam was violent. It was not a religion of peace. It's inherently violent, and did my best to try to demonstrate that. And then the third piece was kind of a quiz, and it just said, where do you stand on human rights issues? You might be surprised to see how it turns out where you stand. So I had given a whole bunch of information about Muhammad, and that was enough for Daily Kos. I was banned. I was done. There are hundreds and hundreds of comments, not really one of them responding to the content of anything I'd said. They all said I was right-wing, an Islamophobe, a bigot, a Christian extremist, which is funny because I don't have a religion. But it was just a mob. I just felt like I was being stoned in the town square.
Eric, let me interrupt for a second. While you were engaged in the writing of those articles and articulating those themes, did you suspect, did you know that this slap, I guess we would call it, would come your way?
I knew a slap would come my way. I honestly thought there would be a little more diversity in the feedback. I thought there would be an intelligent debate as opposed to mob rule,
But so, you were aware that you were kind of breaking a taboo in the leftist milieu in terms of criticizing Islam, right?
Oh, I thought I may very well get myself removed from Daily Kos. Absolutely.
Right. Tell me, how did you find out? Was it an email? Was it a phone call? Is it one particular individual that just said you got to go? How did that go down?
Daily Kos has a system where the registered readers can sort of rate you. And if enough people rate you negatively, it goes into an auto ban mode. So the computer banned me. I have since attempted to reach out to the editors who've not responded to my emails, and I don't think that they will.
I think this is an example when sometimes democracy or voting can become very totalitarian, right?
The tyranny of mob rule.
Yeah. Eric, were you a bit sad? Were you surprised? Were you angry? What were some of your thoughts and emotions when this happened?
Profoundly disappointed. Profoundly disappointed. It's just amazing to see so many people being so incredibly narrow-minded.
Right.
I mean, when you actually see it, it's just disappointing. It's very disappointing.
And this is not coming from, a right-winger or by any means, a sympathizer of any kind of, at that time, a jihad watch or anything. I mean, you're actually making a documentary, Not Welcome, that's actually standing up for the right to build a mosque in America and against the backlash against it. So you're the last person that I think should be the target of all that name-calling and those accusations, right?
Yeah, it is pretty ironic that way.
I want to move on. I also want to discuss not only, of course, Islam. We want to discuss today, what is it in the left? What are these? Because I've dedicated my life to studying and trying to understand this. Why this disposition, this reluctance to tell the truth about enemy cultures, about enemy ideologies, etc. But first, we have a prominent intellectual in our presence this evening, Dr. Furnish, and Dr. Furnish will enlighten us a little bit as to perhaps what's going on here. Dr. Furnish, can you first give us your thoughts on this saga that happened to Eric?
Well, it's not surprising at all to me, and really, I think what's worth talking about, Jamie, is that it parallels, and I'm not sure which comes first, the chicken or the egg here, but it parallels what's going on in the administration. I've had some things happen to me that are not as high profile as what's happened to Eric, but they're very similar. I have been for the last several years a guest lecturer at Joint Special Operations University in Tampa, which is run by the Army, but it's basically a program where we bring in officers from foreign allied countries, and we teach them about basically some degree of sort of getting an idea of what American culture is like, and also what we do with American Special Forces operations procedures. And I regularly lecture 3 to 4 times a year on a block of instruction called History of Terrorism. Now, it's rather difficult to talk about the history of terrorism, and I went back to ancient times. I went back to biblical texts and the Assyrians and up through the Middle Ages, but it's very difficult to talk about this topic without talking about Islam just a bit, since even by the State Department's own statistics, 28 of 49 foreign terrorist organizations right now are Islamic in ideology and motivation. I was recently told that I would not be invited back for any more lecturing at Joint Special Operations University because the foreign students complained, and one can probably safely assume this was the foreign Muslim students, complained that I talk too much about Islam. Mm-hmm. So rather than, sort of man up to that and say, well, let's face reality and let's talk about this. And trust me, I did it in a very, I thought, rather non-threatening and non-offensive way. Of course, you have to wonder if someone's an 04 or an 05 from a foreign military and they work in special operations, do I really have to treat them like a child? But I guess I should have. But and also I used to lecture at a facility called institution called Federal Law Enforcement Training Center down in Glencoe, Georgia, a few hours from me. That's the main training facility for the Department of Homeland Security. And I also was disinvited from coming back because I dared to talk about things like jihad. And this follows on, Eric probably knows something about this, follows on from a series of articles, at least one article in Wired magazine, which basically the journalist, and I don't remember who it was, went out and Freedom of Information Act got information on people that were doing counterterrorism training. And basically, if anyone didn't just say positively rosy, glowing things about Islam all the time, they were called an Islamophobe, and pressure was brought to bear on them. So this is going on in the administration, parallel to what's going on. And, of course, we have a liberal administration. It's parallel to what's going on with what happened with Eric.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. Eric, before I begin with some questions, you have a comment to anything Tim was saying?
Well, my feeling is that the I don't know if it's a consensus, but there's a widely held point of view in the liberal culture that the right wing is lacking in empathy, sympathy, kindness, and they tend to identify with Muslims as the underdog, as the victim. So the natural tendency is to come to the defense. So if I've criticized Islam, people might hear that as criticizing Muslims. So then immediately they think, well, you just must be right wing. So I think that's one of the areas where there's just some confusion. Is people's inability to separate Islam from Muslims.
Well, and I think that really what's happening here is that the left has constructed this. Of course, this is how they work their weaponry. I mean, let's begin with this. All of us, in our own way, have by this point now been the victims of this kind of mob attack. Tim has just talked about it. What's happened to you at Daily Kos? I mean, I can not just what happened to my parents in the Soviet Union, but I can tell you what it was like being in academia for 15 years as a person who openly said that I like Ronald Reagan. I mean, talk about hate and the way that they treat people.
Right.
But let me say this. I think that this is the key, that they pretend that we're saying something about Muslims, those of us who care about the security of the West, the security of the United States. The key is that this isn't about Muslims. There's a Muslim that lives down the street here that's a great guy and is not interested in terrorism. But the key is that according to Islam, he is a bad Muslim in the sense that he's not adhering and following the mandates of Islam. So I think the crucial thing is to always crystallize that we are speaking about the ideology of Islam and not about the Muslim people.
Well, it's very hard to get that point across to people. I mean, it seems plain and obvious to us, but it's really very, very, it is an enormous challenge to say, how do we spread information without it being perceived to be spreading hatred? I mean, that's a really difficult task.
And that's the left's weapon. They love to say that, hatred's being spread when in fact, that's their way to continue attacking this society by saying that their opponents are actually the hateful ones. But we'll get to that. Eric, first, before we go on to Tim and continue this discussion, tell us a little bit about the Daily Kos and tell us a little bit about Loon Watch.
Well, Daily Kos is, branded as liberal, but within there's quite a wide range of points of view, with the exception of Islam. Occupy Wall Street is a perfect example. You do have the people who just think, tax the rich and that'll solve everything. But you also have a lot of people who are incredibly disillusioned with Obama, who think that the government is as much of a problem as big business. You have anarchists. There's a range within there. So, which is part of why I was so surprised at how they handled this issue with
Eric,
Islam.
1 second. Stupid question, but got to put it out there. They're disappointed with Obama, obviously, from the left. They consider that he's not left enough.
Absolutely. They consider that he has sold them out and that he's a plutocrat.
Yeah, I always find it interesting that anybody that's against Obama is called a racist, but that's only if you're right wing. So I guess we can't call all of them racists, right? Because the ones that hate Obama from the left, are they racist as well? But I guess that doesn't.
Within the left, oftentimes they are called racist.
Yeah,
it's a slippery area. But they're less within the left. They're less suspicious.
So they're very disappointed in Obama. And tell us about Loon Watch.
Well, Loon Watch calls itself an Islamophobia hate watch, Islamophobia watchdog site. And it says all the right things. We condemn Hamas. We condemn terrorism. But in fact, the way that it's structured is anything that happens, any legitimate and valid criticism of Islam. For example, this movie that just surfaced with the NYPD, The Third Jihad, that is not an Islamophobic documentary. So they come out and say it's Islamophobic. If you disagree, you're a loon. You're an Islamophobe. If you disagree in writing, you're the loon at large, and they will put your name out.
And Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller have been the victims, I think, of a lot of their attacks and slander, correct?
They seem to exist primarily to attack Spencer and Geller, as far as I can tell.
Eric, how about your own intellectual journey in terms of what you think about an individual such as Robert Spencer, what you thought back then and what you think of him now in terms of how everything has happened? And I think you've also increased your intellectual inquiry. I think you've been reading some Spencer's work. I think you've contacted him as well.
Yeah, we've been in dialogue. I've read a lot of work, not just Spencer's. You know, initially I knew him by reputation. The people who wanted to stop the mosque in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, a lot of them do read Jihad Watch. Mm-hmm. And so my first impression wasn't good because these are a lot of uneducated people who actually think that it says in the Constitution that America is a Christian country. Some of them even thought it said it in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And they were followers of Jihad Watch, so I was wrongly judging him by some of his followers. When I actually sat down and read the truth about Muhammad and did my own research, I found, wow, this doesn't look like hate speech to me as far as I can tell. This is all verifiable fact.
And all Spencer's really doing is just saying what the theological texts in Islam say. He's just simply repeating what they say.
Right, but unlike, let's say, Dr. Terry Jones in Florida who's saying Islam is of the devil, as far as I can tell, I've never encountered anything that Spencer's saying that qualifies as hate speech. Mm-hmm. One may agree or disagree with his analysis as far as how much of a threat is Islam in the United States. Is there such a thing as creeping Sharia? But that's not hate speech. That's just a difference in opinion.
Tim, what's happening in our society that the truth can no longer really be said? You were a victim of being punished for truth-telling. Now we see individuals such as Eric being actually fired from an organization/magazine for even daring to say some truthful things about Islam. How do you see all of this sociologically, politically?
Well, I think, and Jamie, you know, you've written a book on a very similar topic. I think that we've gotten to the point where in the Cold War we had the anti-communist, now we have the well, I'm not sure, jihadists or Islamists or almost just anti-Islam. Mm-hmm. Not all, but many folks on the left have gotten to the point where whatever a conservative, and particularly a Christian conservative, says must be opposed. I mean, I think Eric would probably agree with me on that. I don't think I'm out on a limb there.
No, I think you're right.
You know, I spent 7 years as a college professor. I don't know how you made it 15 years, Jamie. I could barely make it 7. Yeah. It was just maddening. It was the mindset was just so, you know, it was so ironic because on one hand, folks on the left will celebrate how open-minded they are, but when you advance an idea with which they don't like, their first response is not to respond to you, but to shut you up.
Yeah.
And this is what we've gotten into.
They're like the Hitler brown shirts. It's the Hitler's brown shirts, Mao's red guards, right?
It's unfortunate. And the thing that's, again, irony, piled upon irony here, is that Islam is perhaps not just the most violent, but the most illiberal faith system extant in the world today. But yet we find the American left and the European left, but that's a whole other ball of wax, I guess. But many on the American left, not all, but many on the American left are willing to defend a religion that the holy text of which tells you that you are allowed to have multiple wives and beat them if they don't behave.
Yeah. And
I mean,
this
is just amazing.
Yeah, and what I've learned from my own life, and as I continue this battle, I've been around these people and also studied what they do. This is the key. I'll give a quick anecdote, I think, that crystallizes this. I was in a lounge one time in graduate studies with a radical feminist, and she was on the brink of tears telling me that the way that capitalism decapitates women is by forcing them to wear bikinis. And she was very angry and very upset about this. And then, of course, about abortion and, all their issues, right? So so I said, I obviously might even commit suicide if women aren't allowed to wear bikinis, but that's for another show. But then I said, okay, fantastic that you're interested in women's rights. Maybe you will help me with something I'm doing about honor killings of women in the Islamic world and about female genital mutilation, 6,000 girls a day. in the Islamic world have their private parts, sexual organs ripped out of their bodies with glass and other instruments. Can you help me with this? Can you sign a petition? Can you get involved? And she was just horrified. She turned pale. She got angry. And then later, of course, I'm a fascist, etc. But, I've always thought about that, and I can give another million examples, and I'm sure that both of you can as well, right?
Horrified that you said that, Jamie, right? Not that this was going on.
Pardon me?
The the horror was that you said that, not that these sorts of practices go on.
And so what I want to just throw out for this discussion, because this is straight out of my heart, because I come from a country and a society where my family relatives, my people were butchered and barbarically, viciously killed and tortured by the Stalinist Soviet regime, and the Western leftist intellectuals didn't care, and they laughed and they scoffed, and they used to tell my parents and they used to tell me that, that we're more oppressed by having to choose between Colgate and Crest, that's more oppressive than what the Soviets did in Czechoslovakia and in Hungary. So I grew up with a hatred in my heart for those people that denied real suffering in the world, right? So I just want to give that background. Don't want to give a long lecture here, but what I want to say is by studying their mindset, they want to destroy this society. They hate the Western society. They hate capitalism. They hate freedom. So therefore, if you want to destroy this society, if you hate this society, if you have to admit that there is an evil adversary that's actually worse, and that actually what we have is worth defending and worth saving, that's a huge step to take. Because if you admit that there's something else that's more evil and that we need to defend what we have, then you have to give up your entire agenda and your entire identity. And 99% of them are not willing to do that. Eric made the step. David Horowitz made the step. Phyllis Chesler made the step. But I know a million of them that simply cannot make that move because it's more important for them to be popular. It's more important for them to be accepted by their leftist milieus. So it's a social life for them, and it's also, it's their political cause. I just want to throw that out there. Eric and Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could comment on that. What you said is, in my mind anyway, really a statement about human nature more than about the left. I think most of that can be said about a lot of people on the right, and it's not because of the ideology of the right or the ideology of the left. I think your average person is just deeply indoctrinated. Their thoughts are the result of conditioning, and they're afraid of having an original thought. They're afraid of alienation. They're afraid of questioning beliefs that make them comfortable. And when you challenge that, they can get very hostile.
But Eric, I want to interrupt quickly. I will tell you that for 10 years working with David Horowitz at Front Page, he has ordered me, suggested to me, always pushed me to invite leftists onto Front Page for dialogue in symposiums, on this radio show, everything. He's invited them to speak. He wants to create a forum where they can be dialogue. In return, they've called him names. They've slandered him. We've invited people from The Nation magazine and leftist magazines to talk with us at Front Page. They will never invite David Horowitz over to The Nation for a symposium. So I think that needs to be said, that the left is far more totalitarian on this realm.
And Jamie, let me jump in here if you will. Eric, I think, is onto something very important here, and I agree with what you said, that at the top level, sort of the intellectual level of much of the left in this country, that's exactly right. I don't think that fully accounts for when you read the comments on the Daily Kos. I don't think everybody commenting on the Daily Kos is quite at that level. I think they are a product of what Eric's talking about, which is the alienation and the indoctrination. Now, who's been doing the indoctrination for the last 40 years in this country? It's primarily been left-of-center public schools. I'm avoiding this like the plague. I have my children in, as I was telling Eric kiddingly one day, Little Crusader, Christian school. My kids are in Christian school, and if I have to, sell one or both of my kidneys, I could do that in order to keep them out of public schools, because I saw the products of public schools when I was teaching college in Georgia. And, God love them, good kids, and a lot of them well-meaning, and I'm sure many of their teachers were well-meaning. But they came into college, and all they knew, one of the things that they knew very well was slavery and the oppression of black people in the United States.
Yeah.
But they knew almost nothing, none of them. I could count on one hand in 7 years of teaching the number of students who knew that the Arab and Islamic slave trade long pre-existed and long continued to exist after the transatlantic slave trade stopped.
Right, and so Tim, but
all they knew of slavery was white people had done it. They never knew that any other kind existed.
Right, but Tim, why is it that today when I tell a leftist, oh, you're so upset about slavery, so you're against humans owning a slave, and they will say yes, and they're very upset because they think it's white people, right? And then I tell them about how Arab Muslims today are still enslaving black Africans, and all of a sudden they're not very interested anymore. And my point is, it's not about slavery, it's not about gay rights, it's not about women's rights, because their interest in women's and gays' rights disappears almost immediately once it's time to petition Hamas against Hamas and Iran. It's because those issues are weapons for them with which they can beat their own society.
And again, Jamie, I think you're right on the sort of intellectual leadership level, but I think also Eric's got a good point, and I think that on the level of your average person in the street who is, left wing as opposed to right wing, okay?
Right, okay.
I think that person has just been told for so many years of education that Western civilization has been sort of a negative in society. Yeah, well, we got rid of Hitler, but we also did slavery, and the Crusades. That's wielded like a talisman, by the left. If you mention Islam, within 10 seconds, someone will bring out the Crusades, and little difference that was 900 years ago when we're talking about atrocities being done by Islam today. But I think people have just been inculcated with these views, and it's just, I think a lot of it, Jamie, is just ignorance.
Well, and let me say that Eric is also what I see from what I've read, and I've researched some nobility in Eric is from the other side. For instance, he's being very genuine in this documentary that he's making, that he's run into some what he saw as repulsive people that were against the mosque being built. Eric, do you want to talk a bit about that? Did you what was your experience in running into some of those people that you say that really turned you off?
I would, but if I could just comment about the last thing that was said. If I could. I think one of the reasons why you find people on the left not wanting to validate the points you make about Islam is not so much that they disagree, but they don't want to validate you and give you power. The perception is that the Iraq War was wrong morally, and that it was what was really behind it was either a quest for oil or a born-again Christian president who is a fanatic who thought, this is the end times, I've got to get troops close to Israel, Jesus is coming soon. So they feel the number of people killed in Iraq is so enormous that the issue of Islamic terrorism is, if you fuel that, you're just manufacturing consent to go ahead and bomb Iran and bomb the next oil-rich Islamic country. I'm not saying that I agree with them, but they're not out to the left isn't out to destroy America. They just have a point of view, and the point of view is that this Islamophobia thing, which is how they think of it, an irrational fear of Islam, is being used as a device to further agendas having to do with foreign policy.
Okay. I would, I understand that you're painting their views. I would, of course, this is not for this discussion here today, but I would say that Bush was very unfairly caricatured in that way, and the people that did die in Iraq were the people that were dying from Islamic terrorist attacks. But I understand the point you're making in terms of how you're saying that the left thinks.
Right, that's all. I'm not necessarily condoning all of that. There are parts of that I agree with and parts I disagree with. But I think that that's the point of view. So they don't want to add fuel to that fire because they think it's going to be used as a reason to bomb Iran, and they're mostly against the idea of bombing Iran.
I see. Well, we can get into maybe why it might be important to bomb Iran hypothetically, if it might stop mullahs who want to use engage in a nuclear strike, but maybe against Israel, but we might get to that. Just a sec. Eric, tell us a little bit about, there's a mosque being built, and, I would say that, we all know that mosques are not just, this is the thing, mosques are not just these religious buildings.
Sure.
The way that Muslims see mosques and, how radical Islam sees mosques is these are, political institutions, they're supremacist institutions. There's often violence that's nurtured there. There's a legitimacy in being concerned that there's a spread in this way. But what's your experience? And you ran into some people that you did not like that opposed the mosque being built.
Sure. Well, I didn't like them when they were threatening my life. So, okay, so I started off by saying, I think your concerns are legitimate. I share your concerns. But there was a sort of a town hall meeting. This isn't a big town. And about 600 people showed up, and this is what got my attention. And it was on ABC News, and the people said, we don't want this mosque because there's only one God, and his son is Jesus Christ, and he died for our sins, and this is a Christian nation. And it wasn't just ABC News trying to grab the really nutty sound bites. I talked to these people, and it seemed to be mostly a Christian Zionist, end times oriented, radical evangelical Southern movement that, I think to kind of maintain the home court advantage. We can't let those Muslims in there. Some of the people were educated about the real risks of Islam, but the most vocal people, their reasons were a little half-baked, and they were aggressive. Arabic and Muslim kids in school were being beat up, they still are, and being called terrorists by other kids who obviously learned this at home. So, my experience was the rank-and-file Muslim in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, is not synonymous with the Islamic leadership in the world. I met lots of women who didn't wear hijabs, lots of men who drank, lots of people who, Muslim and everything, but they're not die-hard true believers, and in fact, they were mostly pretty good people. And I thought they were getting a raw deal from the radical fringe element in Murfreesboro, Tennessee.
Now, just a sec. The last part.
Jamie, can I say something on this?
Go ahead.
If you don't mind. I for a while before he went down in flames, I was sort of an unofficial policy advisor helping out with the Herman Cain campaign. And I don't know if you remember, but Herman kind of stepped on it several times with the issue of Islam and how to deal with it. He sort of lurched from position to position. And the Murfreesboro Mosque was one of the positions, one of the issues that Herman, I thought, was just all over the map on, and because, frankly, I don't think they were listening to me. But I know something about the Murfreesboro Mosque. Anyway, at the risk of hubris. But anyway, so I understand what Eric's saying, and that's just ridiculous. And in fact, Herman Cain's first remarks on this were something to the effect, I believe he even said this to Chris Wallace on Fox, something about people should have the right to prevent a mosque being built in their community. And I just started hitting it on my head on the wall when I heard that. I'm like, you can't, of course you can't say that. This is America. We have freedom of religion, and that includes Muslims and people that practice religions that are, that we don't necessarily like, the majority of the Christians. That's just the way it is. But exactly. I would say also that on the other side of the fence, it's the media and also folks on the left made it very difficult to even ask questions about things. And I pointed out, I think people in the local community, when a new church is being built, journalists will tell you, or you can find out, is it Catholic, is it Lutheran, is it what is it? Is it Jehovah's Witness, is it Mormon? But you will find these sort of like anodyne, uninformative stories in the media saying, oh, a mosque is being built. Well, are you even aware, the people that write these stories, that there are different sects of Islam? And yes, many of them are peaceful, but some of them aren't. And where is the funding coming from this mosque? Are they getting the literature, the famous studies about the 80-some% of the mosques in this country get Wahhabi literature, which is pretty anti-Western and pretty anti-Christian and Jewish. I think those are legitimate questions. And again, Eric, look, I'm a recovering redneck. I know the kind of people where you speak, all right? I grew up in Kentucky. I grew up with those folks. and they embarrass me, and somebody needs to put them in their place. It's ridiculous. But on the other hand, I do think folks in the local community do have the right to ask questions. So, what kind of sect of Islam is this? It's just as wrong for the left to say that. And I'm not saying you're saying this, Eric, but some do. That it's just wrong for the left to say that all Muslims are, peaceful people, and there's just a few dozen bad apples, as it is for the right to say they're all a bunch of jihadists. So I think local communities do, and I tried to stress this to Kane, but it didn't get through to the folks. Local communities, I think Murfreesboro people have a right to know what kind of. And I think a lot of it probably was frustration because they couldn't get information about it, but that doesn't excuse their overreaction.
Well, I think they really shot themselves in the foot. Their concerns were legitimate. Is this imam a member of the Muslim Brotherhood? Where are you getting your funding from? You say you're Sunni. What kind of Sunni?
Right.
There were plenty of legitimate issues, but the way that they were pursued was in court, and they went to court to try to get an injunction to stop permits for construction. With this country lawyer who is, I don't know how he made it through law school. I mean, it was just a parody. It was hilarious. And his whole premise was, Islam's not really a religion. It's more of a terrorist movement. Therefore, they shouldn't be allowed to build. And, of course, they lost, and it was humiliating, and the news was all over it. There probably was a better way to say we have some legitimate concerns, and they didn't take that route. So...
Right.
Their more vocal spokespeople were not their best foot forward.
Right.
So, but I'm by no means saying in the documentary they're wrong to be concerned. I think it's a very legitimate concern. If Scientology was coming to your town, that's a legitimate concern too. But to say let's not give them a permit because we just know what they're going to do, I think that's not American. It's not humane, and it's just not how we do things in this country.
Yes.
You wait for them to break the law, and then you deal with. We already have laws in the book. I don't think we need anti-Sharia laws. We have laws already. Enforce them.
So, thank you, gentlemen. Eric, tell us. So, just for you, in terms of you yourself personally, where are you right now in your own intellectual journey? For instance, 2 years ago, what were you thinking? What are you thinking today? Crystallize it for us in terms of what you thought about Islam 2 years ago, what you thought of this whole thing, and after being fired from the Daily Kos, and now where your, where your research is taking you, where your thoughts are taking you.
2 years ago, I had funding to make a documentary, and signed a non-disclosure agreement, so I can't say where the funding came from. And the focus was on radical, evangelical, end times extremism in America and how it pertains to this small town. Along the way, I started to do a lot of research, and I said, hey, you guys, I think we really need to expose the craziness of Islam if we're going to be fair here. And I lost my funding. So
right.
That happened before I wrote the articles on Daily Kos. So, what happened is I think I started with a premise of thinking Islamophobia, the irrational fear of Islam, was something that was being mostly made up by people who are either opportunists wanting to make money or trying to manufacture consent for war. And along the way I found out that I think there are those elements, but I can't reduce it to that. The fact is even the most nutty of some of these Tennessee people, they're only half wrong. And, a lot of their concerns are very valid. And if I'm going to make an honest documentary, those concerns need to be in there. Is Islam really a religion of peace? Is it just a religion? No. And I think that needs to be addressed.
Eric, have you lost any friends since this whole ordeal has occurred? Because the left can be very unforgiving.
I think the humans can be very unforgiving. When you break from the tribe, people don't like it. It doesn't matter left, right. If you tell your parents you're not Jewish anymore, not Catholic anymore, it's I've made some new friends, and I've also lost some friends. So my commitment here is to the truth. My main concern really is human rights, and I thought the Muslims were getting a raw deal. But when I look at the big picture in the world, to be honest with you, I'm far more concerned with the threat of radical Islam in the world than, not to minimize it, but how these Muslims are being treated in Murfreesboro.
And
so
that's
the documentary will portray both.
Yeah, and that's
but
what
the
I was
bigger
going to
concern
say.
for me is in post-Arab Spring is this Islamification that's happening in these countries very rapidly. I mean, we're really seeing a lot of radicalism happening fast, and I'm deeply concerned.
And Tim, what I'm getting a little bit tired, a lot tired of over these years is, the left and the liberals when they point to, the quote unquote nuts in the America's Bible Belt and how scary they are. I mean, the 17,000 terrorist attacks since 9/11 were not perpetrated by those people. I mean, what kind of threat do they really represent to the world in comparison to what jihadists are doing?
Well, I don't know too many Southern Baptists that fly airplanes into buildings. I mean, they do other things I don't like, but flying airplanes into buildings is not one of them. Well, yes, and again, you can talk till you're blue in the face, and you can't get a liberal Episcopalian to admit you're right about that one. It's interesting, Eric. I didn't realize you were interested in eschatology, and you probably know, but by this point, that Islamic eschatology is sort of my specialization. I went to Iran and actually came back. I don't think I can go again, but I went a few years ago and came back. and it's interesting there because even there, I think that, and Jamie probably knows this. Jamie knows some of the stuff I've written. I think that there is a bit little. I don't ascribe, for instance, to the thesis that the Iranians want to nuke Tel Aviv to cause the return of the 12th Imam, because I don't think, A, that accords with actual 12 or Shia teachings, and B, I don't think the Ayatollahs are that stupid. But if you have to sort of measure relative eschatologies and which one is more dangerous, Christian or Muslim, I don't think there's much choice. I mean, there may be some unsavory, and there certainly are some unsavory and embarrassing folks on the left behind realm in the Christian world, but they really aren't the ones that are trying to actively bring about unpleasantry and the return of any eschatological figures in Islam. So Eric and I will probably have to discuss this further at some point, Jamie, but yeah, the larger issue, of course, aside from eschatology, is just that the intrinsic teachings of Islam, and if anyone is really honest enough to study them, do mandate that Muslims work toward, either passively or actively, sort of Islam's, really there's another way to say it, Islam's conquest of the world, whether that's through converting everyone to Islam or active military subjugation. I mean, the Quran sort of mandates this, and this isn't the case for Jews and for Christians with their teachings. So,
yeah. It's not a hatred of Muslims at all to simply state the fact that that's what Islamic theology and what Islamic texts preach.
I mean,
Christians are enjoined to... Go ahead.
Be concerned about it. It's just basic self-preservation. Everybody should be concerned. I don't think everybody should be scared or freaking out. Concern. There's a difference between fear-mongering and hate-mongering and just saying, I'm concerned. And I think it's a valid concern in light of the facts.
Gentlemen, we are going to go to our phone lines that are lighting up. We're going to go to Toronto, Canada. We have a note here that a caller, Stephen, has just fought off a polar bear and is making a call from an igloo from Canada. Stephen, are you there? Hello, Stephen.
I think the polar bear won.
1 second. Daniel, are you there? I think he's on hold with him, maybe screening his call. 1 second. So while we get Stephen, go ahead, gentlemen, make some more concluding comments before we get to Steve.
Well, I'd like to add to what we had just said here. In my mind, clearly Islam presents the bigger threat of actual violence and human rights abuses. I think Christianity presents a threat, generally speaking, because a belief system that says you're constantly under surveillance by God, and if you do something that He doesn't like, you'll be cast into a lake of hellfire for all eternity, I feel does psychic damage to the society, and it cripples the people's ability to think critically. And if we can evolve out of superstitious thinking, I think we will just I always think, imagine where science would be today if the church never existed. I feel that, religion's done more harm than good. So I think there's a world of difference between Christianity and Islam. In my mind, they're both destructive forces in the world.
I would counter that very briefly in saying that, the Bolsheviks and the communists got rid of the Ten Commandments, and we saw what happened there. I think that, there's a great argument that, religion has done also a lot of good, and there's a big difference between Jesus Christ, who taught peace and love, and another leader, Muhammad, that taught war and subjugation of non-believers.
There's a world of difference. But do we need a list of 10 do's and don'ts to know that you shouldn't kill? I mean, I think we sort of just kind of are born, most of us, unless you're a psychopath, with a conscience. You just know it's counterintuitive to hurt other people. We know this.
Well, if we're going to get into a philosophical discussion, then if we were to say that we were born with a conscience, then it could be argued that there's a God that exists, and therefore that there's a justification for morality and belief in religion. But let's continue that. I just found out my technical assistant's telling me that Steve got out of the grasp of a polar bear, and he is there now. Stephen?
Yes. How you doing, Jamie?
Okay. Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. The polar bear's not doing very well.
Okay, so you're calling from Toronto, Canada.
Yes, I am.
Okay.
I just had a question for you two gentlemen about that mosque in Murfreesboro. What struck me, what also strikes me about these mosques going up in Europe is the size. This is a 50,000 square foot mosque, apparently.
53,000 square foot Islamic center, 10,000 square feet of which is the mosque itself.
Like it must just be dominating building in Murfreesboro then.
Not compared to the mega churches in there. It's about the size of a couple mega churches and not quite as big as a couple others. But it'll be sizable.
But now
it's going to invite a lot of Muslims who aren't there now. That's for sure.
Now, Steve, in terms of the tone of your question, what are you also implying that there is
a
danger?
Well, it sort of is. Like I see in Europe, when I read about these new mosques going up, they're huge. They're putting up one of the largest in Europe beside the Cologne or close to the Cologne Cathedral. It's like we're competition. It's kind of like we're dominating. We're the most important religion. This is a message, this kind of architecture. They're making a statement with the size of the building. And that's one thing. The other thing I'd just like to ask is about the Christians there in Murfreesboro. I think someone might be angry too, or did you run into this by the fact that Christians aren't treated with the same respect in Islamic countries as Muslims are treated in America and other Christian countries? Did this have an effect on their opposing this new mosque?
Well, okay, so before I say anything more critical about the Christians in Murfreesboro, it should be pointed out that there are a number of Christian churches in Murfreesboro that are holding classes on Islam around the idea of tolerance and not hatred. So it's not like all the Christians are evil, or I don't want to give that impression. That said, there are some who think that as long as Saudi Arabia does not allow the construction of churches, we shouldn't allow the construction of mosques. And, of course, that means you sort of become the very thing you're fighting. I mean, do we want to start having our own Islamic law? So I would say it's a fringe group. It's not a majority, consensus. But there are those who feel that that's unfair, so why should we allow a mosque here?
But, Eric, let me say, it's not just Saudi Arabia. I mean, you're well aware that,
right.
And it's interesting, I'm always having this discussion with my Jewish friends, probably the most persecuted group of people in the world today is Christians in Muslim countries, not just Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Indonesia, Iraq, Iran.
Syria recently.
What I find interesting,
Yes, and what's interesting is I have some good friends who are ministers and priests. One of whom is an Episcopal priest, and I'm always chiding him. I say I don't hear much from the Episcopal Church or from the Anglican Church standing up for these persecuted Christians, but to their credit, a lot of the evangelicals are. And again, this doesn't excuse any sort of boorish behavior or violence toward Muslims in Murfreesboro, but at least on the radar screen of a lot of the evangelical conservative churches is the persecution of, frankly, non-evangelical Protestant Christians in most Muslim countries.
Right. There's a big comparison to be made. I mean, what's happened in Murfreesboro is outrageous and is wrong, but quite frankly, it's nothing compared to Christmas Day in Nigeria when 15 Christian churches are bombed. I mean, that's.
I just wanted to say that,
and also how this is ignored in publications like the Daily Cost and in the leftist media and the liberal media. I mean, what's happening to the Christians?
But Jamie, it's not just in these publications; it's also in the mosques themselves, like the ones being built in Murfreesboro. They're not going to take the cause up of Christians being persecuted in Islamic countries.
Well, I don't think the quid pro quo argument is always, even as a Christian, I don't necessarily find that a false argument. I mean, recently, back last fall, there were a number of liberal Christian churches. They've involved in something called the Interfaith Alliance, who were inviting imams over to their churches and reading from the Qurans in the pulpits of the churches. But I did not read one example. I don't know of one example in North America where a mosque is inviting a priest or a minister over to read the gospel from the minbar. Well, it's always a one-way street.
And I was going to say,
how many mosques are taking up the cause of persecuted Christians in Islamic countries? Like this mosque in Murfreesboro, I doubt will take that up. The Pope says he doesn't expect to see a single Christian in the Middle East in 25 years, the rate the persecution exodus is going.
And what I was also going to say, when Eric, brought up that there's obviously some Christian groups that are teaching tolerance, etc., that I find it very interesting. Where in the mosques, where in the Muslim communities are they rejecting Islamic supremacism and teaching that other faiths and other members of religions are equal and should be treated as equals?
That's where it gets so tricky, because I can tell you in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, the mosque had numerous community outreaches. I've sat in a Presbyterian church and seen the imam come to talk to the people. What he says is all the right stuff. What they say on their website about terrorism is bad is all the right stuff. The big question mark that we just don't know is that just all talk? I mean, is he a member of the Muslim Brotherhood? How do they really feel about Hamas? They actually dismissed one of their board members because his MySpace page had tons of stuff supporting Hamas and Hezbollah, and it was a real embarrassment. So,
they say one thing.
We just don't really know, separate from their PR, what's really going on there. We don't know.
Absolutely. Well, Eric, absolutely. And with Arafat, there was this great example of what he said to Western audiences and what he also said to his own audiences. Stephen, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Stephen, thank you very much for calling in. We are going to go to Atlanta, Georgia. Mark, are you there?
Yes, I am, Jamie.
Thank you for calling in. Do you have a question to our guests?
Yeah, well, actually, yes, more of a comment than a question. I'm very, number one, Eric, I commend you. I read your piece, an excerpt of your letter to Robert Spencer, and it struck me as amazingly open-minded and willing, I mean, in a very uncharacteristic way, I might add, for most people on the left, to consider other points of view. And I mean, I'm going to bring this up only because, just very quickly, I've lived in the South here. I have family here. I've lived here for the past 15 years. I grew up in the Northeast in Connecticut.
Wait, Mark, are you also like Tim, a recovering hick? What's going on here?
No. What I'm saying is go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
The point I was going to make is this. Okay, I have a lot of family here in the South, in Alabama, in Georgia. I understand the stereotype of the Southern redneck, and obviously there's some truth in that. There is in every stereotype. However, I also notice Eric has made a couple of comments about, some of these people, the most vocal opponents of this mosque, were, these type of, mindless Christian fundamentalists and this sort of thing, and didn't want to listen to reason. And I'm not contesting that. However, I think you also have to consider the most vocal proponents of the Occupy Wall Street movement, for example, the most vocal gay activists. They don't represent exactly, what I would call rational, well-informed people either. So, you can say this about both sides, and I don't think that it's necessarily accurate to say that, people who are opposing or do have some rational basis for opposing this mosque coming into their community are, and I know you're not saying they're completely off base, but on the other hand, look at the percentage of Muslims in that town and the size of that building. I mean, is there any curiosity about where the funding's coming from?
Thank you, Mark. Eric, go ahead.
The concerns are valid. I mean, there's a lot of valid concerns. The people who are really advocating and putting those concerns forward, they're just not the best representatives of the movement in Murfreesboro. So many people talk to me who wouldn't talk on camera and didn't want their names used, and they're like, please don't show us all to be hicks. Most people in Murfreesboro were embarrassed by these stereotypical Southern uppity evangelicals. They really were embarrassed. But, and here's an interesting parallel with the Muslim world, they wouldn't speak up. Their silence was deafening. Just like where are the Muslims saying, this terrorist act that just happened, we oppose it. Why can't you come out and say it? So there's a strange parallel going on there.
Let's let Tim get a word in. Go ahead, Tim.
I ran into somewhat the same situation, although not as intimately involved or as deeply knowledgeable about it as Eric is with the Murfreesboro Mosque. I'm originally from northern Kentucky, and the first mosque is being built in northern Kentucky, not far from Cincinnati, near where my mother lives. And I'm sure that area is majority Baptist, pretty conservative, a lot of Baptists and Catholics. And the first mosque was being built there in northern Kentucky. And I was contacted by some folks up there because they knew I was from there, wanted some information from me, and what could I do? And one of the writers for the Northern Kentucky Cincinnati Enquirer contacted me, and the writer just basically admitted to me, now the mosque is just in the planning stage. They're trying to buy some land, and it's across from a Lutheran church that I know quite well, and the writer contacted me and basically more or less said that any opposition to this mosque, he could only figure was, and this is the newspaper writer, could only be from basically right-wing Christians that are just intolerant. He could not, I mean, he had already formed that opinion right. when all people had just inquired about it. And again, as several people have said, Eric and the last caller, this goes both ways, but I just find it unfortunate that sort of and Eric, I think you'd have to admit this, the overarching mindset of the media, and the left is overwhelmingly media, I think that's hard to argue, is that the default position is we're going to take the side of Muslims and people that want to build mosques over against other people because ipso facto they must be the aggrieved party. Again, I was going to ask you, Eric, what is the Muslim population of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, that they need a mega mosque? Do you know?
One second, gentlemen. Mark, thank you very much for calling. We only have 1 minute left. Eric, go ahead in 30 seconds, please.
Oh, well, it's a tiny population. I don't know what percentage of the population, but the idea that they're going to fill up a 50,000 square foot, it's more of a build it and they'll come. Obviously, they're going to attract a lot of Muslims to the area, and that has people concerned.
But why would they be allowed? Why would they be zoned for a mega mosque if they don't even have the people for it? One has to wonder why would that approval?
I don't know how those zoning laws work. They own the property and they're allowed to build.
Tim Furnish and Eric Bell, thank you very much for joining the Jamie Glazov Show. Hope you'll be back. And Eric, just as a note to you, thank you very much for your courage and nobility. And we're very interested in your continuing pursuit of the truth, and we hope you'll join us again here. Okay?
Would love to. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen, and we are going to depart with a song by Madison Rising dedicated to the soldiers of America. Thank you for listening.
Somebody